I'm Karen Marie Yust, and I will be your host for this panel discussion. As in the previous sessions, participants are invited to post questions during the panel discussion via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen. I'll be monitoring that Q&A button, and I'll be sharing your questions with the speakers, both questions that were posted during earlier lectures and questions that pop up during this session. Please be patient with us and know that it won't be possible to get to every question, but I will try to summarize like questions so that we can cover as many as possible. All three of our lectures are with us for this panel discussion. We have Allan Cole, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work, and also Professor of Psychiatry at the Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. We have Evelyn Parker, the Susanna Wesley Centennial Professor of Practical Theology at Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University. And we have Jean Roehlkepartain, who's Vice President of Research and Development at Search Institute. Each of these individuals has been influential in shaping contemporary understandings and practices of faith formation among young people. I've personally benefited from their research, reflections, and collegiality over the past 2 decades and the last 2 days, and I expect to learn yet more from them in this hour. So let's get to it. As I have been listening to you, and as you have listened to each other's lectures, I'm wondering what intersections with your own work you've heard in your colleagues' presentations. Are there overlapping ideas or complementary findings which you want to call to our attention? I invite each of you to speak to that as we begin our panel.
Well, maybe I'll begin. I want to say again, thank you to Evelyn and Jean for very thoughtful and wise presentations. I, like Karen Marie, benefited immensely from them. I wrote down just a number of words, sort of pushing off of Gene's piece in his lecture to sort of capture what I saw as some of the overlaps or some of the resonance, if you will, or convergence or convergencies, if you will. The first word was connectedness. I think we were all trying to talk about the importance of being connected as human beings in communities. I think most of us, maybe all of us, that's really where it starts. Relationships, of course, equitable relationships, balanced relationships, healthy relationships seems to be a common theme, as does authenticity in relationships, grace in relationships, to pick up on Evelyn's theme in particular, generosity and compassion, community, and then advocacy, which is a piece that I focused a lot on, and I thought particularly with Evelyn's work, advocacy was a common theme, but I also see it in Jean's work with respect to nurturing the kinds of relationships that he's calling for us to nurture.
Thanks, Allan. Jean or Evelyn?
I'll go next. I appreciate those connections, Allan, and I would affirm those. I want to point out a couple that I made connections with both of you all's presentations, which I'm both very grateful for. Allan, in terms of your presentation, the whole idea around spirituality and what I was talking about is the spiritual aspects of a young person, I think is one of the ways that we connected. I mean, that lends itself to a more developed conversation, but I think thinking about the spirituality of young people and Jean, that was in the heart of what you were talking about as well. So in a sense, that's connecting us together. Allan, when you talked about young adults valuing trust, that also was a connecting point for me because from the research that I have done, as well as just anecdotal experiences, I've discovered that the importance of trust to talk about difficult topics like intimate partner violence, teen dating violence is so essential. And if a young person trusts the youth pastor or the responsible adult, then they make those types of connections. And that's relevant to what Jean was talking to as well, because in order to form a significant relationship, there must be some form of trust that that the young person would make, or that would have in the adult person. Um, Healthy relationships is essential to helping young people, especially as early as 9 years old. If they know how to identify and form healthy relationships, that's essential to avoiding teen dating violence. And well, uh, Jean, what can I say? That was it. That was all about it. And if a congregation can model healthy relationships, there we have it. You have it. So I'll stop there. Maybe we can talk about some of these things a little bit more.
Great.
Yeah, thanks to both of you for, I mean, there's so many interconnections. We'll have a fun hour. I guess I want to pick up with different themes in each way and see how they weave together. I think in some ways the work you were talking about around social action, Allan, and young people being maybe misunderstood in the 20s around sort of not being valued in that. I think that was a theme I heard some, and we didn't talk about much in it when I was presenting, but that's one of the places where there's an assumption that kids are not interested and the church isn't talking about it. And so there's a disconnect where many young people are now saying, what I'm interested in and what you're interested in, there's not a connection there. And so this notion of authentically hearing and listening to and engaging with young people around the things they're interested in and engaging with them theologically about that is a really interesting set of questions. And how do we have those conversations, and how do we help young people to develop the language and the critical thinking skills to intersect that work so that they come together, I think, is so that that becomes a theological conversation, not just in addition to a social issue conversation. And so I think that was one of the things I think we need to grapple with, so that those conversations can start happening more in congregations than they are now. Because what I'm sensing is kids are having those conversations, but they're having them in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that's an interesting place to think about, what are we doing with that? And I think that comes back to the hard conversations that you talked about in some ways, Evelyn, in maybe a different context. I think the issue of trust and relationships and intimate relationships really ties really interesting to the framework that we have, and the one area of it that we get the most, shall I just have the most conversations about, which is sharing power in relationships. Why is it there? Can we do that? Can we share power with our kids? We get a lot of pushback from fathers about that. So I guess I raise that because to me, it speaks to the whole issue of every relationship has a power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
How do we think about that? It doesn't mean giving up power, but how do we think about power dynamics in all of our relationships? How do we get honest with that? And how do we help young people begin to understand that there is power in relationships and how we work with those, and use the framework as a tool to be honest about that? And I see a big overlap between what you were talking about, Evelyn, and that part of the framework that is potentially the diciest, but also maybe the most important.
Mm-hmm.
And we seen in some of our analyses that if kids can have that dynamic going on, it is actually the most potentially catalytic for positive development.
Mm-hmm.
So just as an interesting side note.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, there's a lot going on in all of that.
Let's talk some more about this particular topic, because I think the question of difficult topics or different valuing of topics was an issue that got raised around all of your lectures. And how do we actually do that in congregations? How do we have that conversation among the adults who may be pushing back on some of the ideas like sharing power, or who are concerned that young people today are anxious for no good reason compared to, say, previous generations? And how do we have those conversations with youth and young adults, or dare I say, even with children, youth and young adults? What are some things that you might share with us around this authentic conversations that are dialogical rather than unidirectional?
Well, I would start again with the issue of trust. I think any relationship has to develop by virtue of a foundation of trust. I mean, we know developmentally that trust is essential at the earliest moments of life for healthy development subsequently. And when that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean it can't happen later on, but it becomes more challenging. I think this relates to the issue of power, in the sense that to develop trust, I think those who have more power, thinking sociologically more privilege, which often goes with power, have to be able to be more vulnerable, if you will, and to yield power or to suspend power at points in time, in order for those trusting moments to develop into more cohesive, trusting relationships. I think, I don't think it's the right way to go to ask for or to expect people who have been powerless or disempowered to be more vulnerable. Let me be clear about that. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think the vulnerability is essential, but I think that those in power in relationships, individual relationships and community relationships, have to be willing to again, yield or suspend at least some of that power, so that maybe those who have been more vulnerable can have a different place for developing the kind of trust that I think we're all talking about.
I want to build on that because I really appreciate you mentioning the dynamics of power, Gene, because as I think back to my own formation in a small church, a small congregation in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, we were, as youth, we were trusted to do a lot of things. And I'm a member of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, so our congregational aspects has this hierarchy that goes all the way up to the bishop, and having the wherewithal to even approach the bishop about something when we found it problematic probably doesn't happen everywhere, but that was part of my experience. So I think they trusted us to have something to say, but they also valued us. And so I want to move to make a few suggestions, concrete suggestions about how you can enhance conversations in a congregation that supports the idea of sharing power. And it's not well thought out, but the key here, I think, is planning. If you have youth involved in the planning stages of some type of conversation around a tough topic, not the youth that the adults pick, but the youth that the youth pick. In other words, the teenager that is respected among the youth that say that we want you to represent us in the planning of this conversation. I think that's a good starting point. And I would also say that that it is clear that there's a just like when you say that these are going to be the ways that we communicate with each other, and you list them on the board, that adults should also participating in this. These are the ways that we will communicate as we shape this whole setting for talking about a tough topic, and negotiating on which are the topics that you will start with first and move to the ones that are gradually move to the more difficult topics. But then sometimes there's something that happens within the community that you need to talk about it, like shooting in a school, or something that has happened when someone is raped or something of that nature. Those are difficult topics, but but there should be opportunities to plan for those conversations to happen. And I want to lastly stress the importance of having a trained professional present. And I'm talking about a psychologist that can help, because the odds are someone is so immediately affected that there needs to be someone there that is trained to deal with that.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add, sort of maybe different directions. Sometimes I think adults feel like they have to have the answers to the tough topics, and sort of, so I guess that's, just at a really practical level, how do we get comfortable with saying, I don't know, let's figure it out together, and learn, sort of a curiosity and co-learning with young people is modeling continuous growth and learning. I mean, in some ways it seems simple, but it's actually very different than what young people experience often. And to me, it's very different than saying, I don't know, don't bother me. That's very different than, I don't know, let's figure it out together. So to me, that's, let's go on this journey together. So that's one part. The other thing is, sometimes we expect people to go off and have the tough conversations, but without giving them the safe space for it. And I think that's what you were talking about, Evelyn, is we sometimes with families, we've created a space where they can come and talk about stuff that would be very awkward to do on their own. Even if it's not really, really hard stuff, it's just they don't have a rhythm of that in their home. But if we could help them break the ice with a safe space around a table in the church basement, maybe they can then continue the conversation because they've tried it once. And so that kind of thing, just making it easier to get started, maybe the conversation won't be so tough the next time. And so those kind of things. And then there are the really hard conversations like the school shootings and things where it takes more structure and things, but every conversation doesn't have to be as hard. Yeah. And so breaking it down and getting space so that they can start it would be another way to think about it.
One of our participants in listening to Allan's lecture had commented that Andrew Cuomo appears to be able to articulate directly the importance of the words, I don't know, which hopefully will allow young and older to actually be more realistic about being a human being who doesn't know everything. Yeah. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, that's a useful example of what we're talking about here. Someone who can say with authority, I don't know, but we're figuring it out together, might be a model that we want to take into congregational conversations. So,
well said.
Yeah.
Another issue that seemed to come up across all of your lectures in terms of questions that was posed was the role or effect of social media on these various things you're talking about. The role of social media in increasing anxiety or being a place where anxiety is expressed. The role of social media in teen dating violence. The ways in which social media does or doesn't enhance intentional relationships, particularly given the way some teens develop relationships in gaming environments. What would you say about the role of social media in the topics that you're exploring?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think there are virtues, or at least potential virtues, and potential vices that we see across the board in social media. I think on the one hand, social media can connect us in ways that we otherwise wouldn't be connected. My wife and I were talking, recently about how many Zoom conversations we've had with family and friends across the country, even the globe, that we wouldn't have had otherwise. We might talk to them once a year. Now we're talking to them once, every couple of weeks or something like that. Mm-hmm. So we're connected in some new ways via technology. I think social media is like that too. On the other hand, I have two adolescent daughters, and I see the pressures that are generated via social media and the anxieties that go with that. That relate to approximating some perfected life that many of us will be tempted to portray on social media. And on the other hand, I see lots of opportunities for connection and learning when people are authentic and vulnerable and create those open spaces for dialogue. that we've been talking about on social media. I've seen wonderful things happening in that regard. So I think it's a both and answer for me, that it's both potentially troubling for the reasons that we're all talking about, but also a resource that I think if utilized well can actually be conducive to the kinds of connections and relationships that we're trying to develop. The devil is in the details, of course, but I think as an immigrant to social media, if you will, as opposed to someone born into that world, I see a lot of virtues that I didn't see 10, 15 years ago, but it's tricky.
I would agree that there are both some pluses and minuses, some virtues as well as some things that are not good about social media. One thing that is good about social media, particularly as it relates to teen dating violence, that there are some websites that actually use all forms of social media, tweeting, Instagram, and a number of other things that actually address some of the concerns that I've raised. You may or may not be familiar with DoSomething.org. It's a website that champions involvement of young people, teenagers as well as young adults, around social justice issues. So this plays squarely into what you were talking about, Allan. There's a number of social justice issues that are promoted on DoSomething.org, and they had a major campaign at one time around intimate partner violence or teen dating violence that rolled out videos and a number of things. We all know about some of the negative aspects of social media and how it has impacted the lives of young people around cyberbullying. I've found in my own research in South Africa that there's an uptick in cyberbullying between romantic relationships. And we know how deadly, literally deadly, this has been, because there have been some people that have gone to trial because of cyberbullying that were in a past romantic relationship. So these are just some examples of the pluses and the minuses.
Yeah, I won't repeat. I mean, I agree with what both of the other folks have said here. I think the other interesting question about social media is, what can it do that we can't do other ways in terms of relationship building, and what are the unique things that are there? I mean, it's part of our world. It's in some ways, it's another part of the ecology of development now, and kids are living there. It's an integral part of their world, and actually, some folks are now talking about it's not a different part of the world. It's just part of the world. It's seamless, and so how do we discover it that way, and how do we live it that way? And I don't know, I'm too old, I guess, to understand that. So to me, it's an interesting question, is how does it become, what are the unique environments that's there that we can't do things other places, setting aside what's good and what's bad about it, what is unique about it that can be, because it's a unique experience for them and for us, and how can we take advantage of that in the best sense of that, in terms of cultivating relationships. So the young people who are in rural areas, who can stay in touch with friends who are far away because they can't see them very often, and those become the minimal touch points in between times, so that they can then, when they see each other, they don't have so much catching up to do about everyday life, for example. So that's ways of seeing the multiple dimensions of a relationship being connected over time. So just as a small example.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting as we live through this time of a pandemic, and as Allan noted, perhaps are using various forms of social media differently than we might have before. That this is a time where we could really reflect on our experiences of that and think about how that might shape congregational life and family life, rather than just thinking, well, eventually things go back to normal. This is our new normal. Things will continue going forward to involve an awareness that pandemics happen, for instance, and we might need to socially distance. So what would that mean? I've noticed as I looked across the questions that there's also an interest, even though we're talking primarily about youth and young adults, on how our interactions as adults with children, youth, and young adults shapes us as adults. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how what you're studying and looking at have an opportunity to shape the spiritual lives of the adults and parents who are interacting with youth and young people around these concerns.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that, switch it up here a little bit. I think that's actually one of the most underemphasized part of all of this in some ways, because if it's a relationship and if it's two-way, it's got to be affecting both people in the relationship. And I mean, that's sort of just an out there statement. But if you think about it, just from going back to the parenting example, who hasn't been changed by their children? Who hasn't had their life journey affect our life journey, our understanding of the world, all of that kind of stuff? And I see that as a real gift. And I think we can think about that more broadly. We can think about that theologically. What are the passages that immediately come to mind about that? We can all name those. And so, but we don't actually live in our congregations as though that was the truth. We think of children's leadership as being the cute thing that happens on Christmas Eve or occasional worship services, where actually I think it's actually much more than that. And so taking that leadership seriously as not what we script them to do, but what their gifts are leading us toward and what their voice is telling us. In some ways it comes back to those hard conversations that we were talking about. If we're not interested in what they're having to say, maybe we're not paying attention to what we need to be hearing. So to me, it is that two-way. It is a relationship. It is a dynamic that it isn't all about going back to passing down the tradition. It's about listening to who are we listening to and how is God speaking.
Yeah, I talked about in my lecture. I talked about the trust that young people gift us with. Well, I actually moved to talk about that trusting leads to the authority they've given us to be their youth leaders. You cannot go in and superimpose yourself as a youth pastor or youth leader. If they don't trust you, you have failed. And if they have not gifted you with the authority to be their pastor, that's a problem. But if they have, it's a tremendous, priceless blessing. I think on yesterday, I shared my own experience of young people trusting me with some things that were very important to them. They share things with me in confidence, and it's amazingly humbling when you are trusted like that. For me, and I just think that in addition to what Gina said, if that is kind of promoted and encouraged in a congregational sense, then we are all made for the better. Some of my best insights. Let me just say this one. This is a true story. My decision to go to seminary was because of a Sunday school student who questioned what I was saying. I was so literal at that time. I thought the Bible said it, that was it. And this one 9-year-old said to me, "That can't be true." And went on to say, "No one ever lives that long, 900 years, that's just impossible." And I was like, oh. And then I realized that I had a thinking child in my midst, and I too should be learning how to think critically like that. Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I would echo what's been said on this. I've thought many times over the years in terms of congregational life, what if on the church sign or billboard, it said something like, we create and nurture authentic relationships here, instead of sort of leading with programming or leading with other kinds of things, what that might do in the way of reaching out to people in some new ways. I think in a school of social work, we're very relational. We spend a lot of times on questions of relationship and how to build relationships on individual as well as collective levels. And I really do think that whatever the setting, churches or beyond churches, religious communities beyond religious communities, that it really is about intentionality, seeing the other as sacred in his or her own way, and being intentional about encountering the other, quote unquote, with a kind of openness that we don't typically, at least speaking personally, we don't typically lead with unless we're really thinking about it and really are intentional about it. But Emmanuel Levinas, who's a French Jewish philosopher, has this sort of image of human beings encountering one another face to face. And Levinas says, when we encounter another person truly, that person makes an ethical claim on us, and we cannot help but be changed by that. And if we think that's true on some level, maybe a solution to some of the things we're talking about is really trying to be more intentional about living into that or approximating that more often than I think most of us do. And that means, for me, being vulnerable. It means being open. It means saying, I don't know, maybe you know, young child, and I, the older adult, don't know. It means creating that space where all voices and all faces, if you will, are valued equally.
Furthering that, authenticity is a word we're hearing a lot nowadays in many different arenas. And one of our participants on Facebook has noted that there's often this kind of false perfection that's projected on social media. And he suggests that maybe that happens in the church as well. There's kind of this false perception. So what kinds of things do we do to create more authentic interactions? And is that really the right word, or are there other words and concepts we might be using for that? But I think, Allan, you were kind of tipping us in that direction.
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of as easy and as complicated as flattening our organizations, modeling the kind of openness and vulnerability as adults or as people in power, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in the pulpit or the fellowship hall, if you will. I think it has to do with adults modeling for younger people what values we want to embrace for ourselves and others in our community to embrace. I mean, one of the many things I appreciate about the millennials, as I tried to talk about yesterday, is I think they've got those pieces more right than my generation had them. I really think that typically they appreciate flatter organizations. They appreciate more collaborative interaction for decision making. I think they recognize a multitude of gifts and graces, if you will, in ways that maybe my generation is not quite as quick to do. And I think, the millennials are more and more becoming the parents of the younger children in our communities. And I think if we recognize those opportunities that they bring and really invest in them, try to model them ourselves, I think that we maybe take a step or two forward.
Jean or Evelyn, either one of you want to speak to that, or I can throw out another question?
Yeah, I concur. I think that's the response.
I think the other thing I would just add to that, I think first of all that trying to be authentic everywhere, including on Facebook, can get you in trouble. I think recognizing we have private lives and public lives and lives in different places is all just fine. And so I think kids have kind of figured out what you do. Not all kids, we kind of figured that out. And so, yeah, we all know we do this on Facebook or whatever the current platforms are these days, so that's fine. But I think there is a sense of modeling appropriate risk taking, not getting it right, admitting your failures, admitting when stuff, admitting your limitations, working it through, moving forward, all of the kind of stuff, admitting your questions, and then working on them. That kind of authentic engagement in life in the world is something that I think kids really want. And the idea that kind of going back to what we talked about before of assuming that they're coming to us for the answers and knowing everything is actually exactly the opposite of what many young people want. And so to me, that's part of what I think we're talking about is being real. A lot of kids we talked about, they want people who be real with them. They want teachers who'll be real, who'll, not take themselves so seriously, that's kind of language they're using. And so I think the same is true in the church, that kind of stuff is probably going to make the kind of difference we're wanting. And they're not wanting you to be a teenager. They're wanting to be you.
Thinking about some of the questions that came up in relation to what Evelyn was presenting. It seems to me there's a connection to what we're talking about here in terms of being real or being authentic, and questions about how we understand the body. And perhaps, as Allan has observed, just as young people may have some understandings of organizational power, et cetera, that is different from what some of us grew up with, and we appreciate that those flatter organizations look good. I think younger people probably also have a different understanding of bodies and the relationship of bodies to the rest of their being. But I'm wondering how it is, and we've some questions here. How do we introduce this concept of body as tangible grace and bodies as part of who we are, and how we move in the world? When bodies have often been taboo subjects or objects that we manage in particular ways according to social conventions.
Yes, I'll lead off by promoting some books that I've had the blessing of being a part of developing, or at least contributing to. And the first one you all probably recall, or some of you all might be familiar with, is Honoring the Body, that was written by Stephanie Paulsell. Now, that particular book was a spinoff of the book, a chapter in the book called The Practicing Our Faith, that was edited by Dorothy Bass. But Stephanie Paulsell's book gets into talking about the body in a number of ways, that looking at the vulnerability of the body, and touches on some of the topics that we've kind of had conversation about here in terms of trust and relationships, those types of things, and dynamics of power. My chapter, Honoring the Body, was in the book that targeted college students on our way. And in addition to talking about aspect of honoring the body through exercise and drinking and eating and those types of bodily things, I talked about the body that we should honor, even if it has HIV and AIDS, and how that could be a blessing for us. In that same book for college students, Stephanie Paulsell talks about vulnerability and sexuality. So I still think that those are good resources for thinking out loud with congregations and in our classrooms about the human body. I introduced the idea of tangible grace in my chapter on honoring the body, that actually came out of what I consider as the Spirit of God giving me words to affirm my parents on during the time that my dad was retiring from his job that he had been a part of back in Mississippi. And that term, tangible grace, became important for me as he was dying of colon cancer, and a way of me affirming him and reminding him of years earlier that I had thought about that, that term had come to me. So I think those are resources, and I'll stop there, that I offer. I think they're online now. They're still available for ways to talk about this. But those are just some concrete resources that I offer for thinking about this idea of tangible grace that I've offered.
Maybe I put something in the chat, a couple of resources. I think the question of bodies is an interesting one, and I think what Evelyn has said both yesterday and today, I completely agree with. I think on the one hand, we need a more embodied sort of approach to life in general, particularly as it relates to our faith traditions. On the other hand, bodies are complicated, and bodies become ill or diseased in certain cases. They people who live with physical disabilities will often have broader takes on what embodiment might mean than some of us who may not. And I do a lot of work these days on chronic illness and in the health humanities as well. And I think in talking about embodiment, we want to say something like bodies are really important, but bodies are not the only thing that's important about being a human being, and the complexities within bodies matter too. And so when we affirm that, I think we get away from this, or we at least try to get away from this sort of idealization of quote unquote the perfect body, or the only kind of body one can have in order to be sort of fully whatever they want to be. I think we see a lot of that on social media. Certainly, I think women have borne the brunt of some of those sort of societal expectations around perfected bodies, historically more than men, although the data show that men have experienced some anxieties and some other difficulties around those sort of images as well. So I think I want us to talk about bodies, but I want us to complexify what it means to be an embodied creature. It's not as easy as it might seem sometimes.
Absolutely. I want to also say that I'm a strong promoter of how we think about these things in the context of worship. So I think there's opportunities to allow people who have chronic illnesses, or in our congregations, or even persons who are who are suffering from cancer or some type of terminal illness, to actually express or participate with the congregation, or in some way that we allow opportunity for lament and expressing their concerns within the congregation. I think that's a way that brings us closer and allows the congregation to be alongside people who are experiencing chronic illnesses, or in ways through ritual and singing and even the sermons that can bring us closer as a congregation.
There are some questions throughout the lectures in which people kind of wondered about generational differences. Alan talked a lot about millennials, and that prompted questions about, well, how does this compare with Gen Z, which is, I guess, sort of what Gene is focusing on, the latest generation. But also questions about, well, will these young people just kind of naturally come back to the church once they start having children, or is the lag, and are there concerns such that they won't do that? Is social justice, attention to social justice issues going to be enough to bring them back, or do we need to really begin to be church differently? I think you've already hinted at some of these things, but what are your thoughts about what intergenerational ministry looks like after this pandemic that sort of takes seriously youth and young adults and might be a place that they want to be? Or do we just wait until they have children and they'll all come flooding back?
God forbid.
I don't personally believe that's true.
I
But
No, they won't. I mean, there's more and more evidence that has been broken as a pattern. We've passed the tipping point where that as a social norm is going to drive religious attendance. So I don't think we can count on that. Obviously, some will, but I think that's shifted in the last 20 to 30 years, maybe 50 years even. I think we've had an assumption that generations don't get together, and we've sort of bought into the marketing idea that each generation is so different that we have to cater to each generation's market niche, and we have to build a church for that generation. I think that is theologically bankrupt, and it's probably not very good for other reasons either. Sorry, I'm getting too much coffee, I guess. But I think that the richness of intergenerational is that it brings people together who have different life experiences, different interests, different possibilities, different visions, and helps us create a body of a local congregation or a larger body that actually has something imaginative to do and say in the world. And so it's maybe going against the grain of some of what we've thought before, but I think the opportunity lies not in narrow segmentation of what each generation thinks, but listening to each generation and saying, how do your gifts fit into who we are here? How can we use their gifts as part of this body here? And so to me, I become less and less interested in trying to guess large demographic trends and do a marketing campaign for that, and more interested in who are the people in our community, how do we get to know them, how do we invite them to be part of our community and let them shape our community and become part of that community. So it's a different way of thinking. We're in relationship with people. We're not in a direct marketing campaign to get more people to fill our pews.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just real quickly, I think I said yesterday, I think sort of starting where people are is really the only tack we can take. I use the language of starting where the client is, which is what we do in social work education. But I think the analogy holds. We start where people are, build relationships, invite them into our lives. They invite us hopefully into their lives, and then we're all changed in the process of those kinds of encounters. And then we sort of make it up as we go, right? I mean, I instead of having sort of this destination mapped out programmatically or otherwise, I think we maybe more organically sort of live into and out of those kinds of relationships that I think we're all talking about.
Yeah, one of our participants had asked during Gene's presentation, is there a method to form relationships with youth whom you may not have the same hobbies or interests? You can only do so much trial and error before one or both parties disband the relationship. That's the sort of nitty-gritty concern, I think, that's that's insecure in what you're suggesting, Allan, because they're not quite sure how to connect if it's not around similarity. Can you all speak to how difference can be a way of connection, or other ways we might imagine connection beyond overlapping interests?
Well, for me, one focus is on need. I think, most of us would like to be trying to meet needs of one another and of those beyond our doors in our community. And so I think, in my experience, lots of people, children, youth, young adults, older adults can rally around some opportunity to meet a need in the community, or the need that a family within the community has, or something like that. They may have different hobbies and interests otherwise, but there's an opportunity to be an agent of change, or an agent of assistance, if you will. And I think most of us are motivated by that. And I think, personally, I think that's very consistent with the message of the gospel, that we can and should look for those opportunities to support one another.
Yeah. I was really drawn to Gene's suggestion of forming relationships in what I think is a very informal way, and that is when communities gather in public spaces like receptions, or I don't know, banquets, or some type of gathering that the church has, and that not only provides an opportunity for people to be transparent and safe, instead of having these one-on-one mentoring types of settings, but there's ways to do that when there's a gathering, although it might be virtual at this point. But for gathering among a congregation, I'm thinking of my own congregation that has a number of activities that we enjoy together across generations, and dancing together is one of those that we enjoy in my congregation. It's something that all age groups, I'm talking about the 90-somethings down to the 5-year-olds, they enjoy doing, and most of it is line dancing. Now, how we learn how to do line dancing by Zoom is something we will explore, but that's one way that I have connected, or I have seen young people connect with across generations, or form relationships with young people. And putting a little energy into keeping up with what's important for the young people in our congregations is another way that I have had a good experience of forming relationships. Not that I necessarily know all of the names of the young people, but when they have achieved something, when just acknowledging that it's graduation time, or just acknowledging that it's time for, I don't know the name of the test that's in Texas right now. It went from tax to whatever, but whenever that test is time to take the test, that you acknowledge them and tell them that you're praying for them, or just affirm these life transitions that these young people are taking, even if you don't know them personally. I think that's a way of forming relationships that I found helpful in my own congregation.
It's the STAR test, Evelyn. It's the STAR test.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, what I love about this question, because it really points to how we can expand what it means to be in a relationship. Because it's sort of, when we think about adult youth relationships, it's often our first thing is it's about this sort of caring, fun thing that we do. And that's part of it. But I was actually just taking notes to myself, using the 5 elements of the framework and saying, okay, what else could we do besides a hobby? And so what about storytelling? What about teaching each other to ask about each other's stories, life stories? Because most people in the congregation, I bet, don't not know much more than each other's names. Maybe a little bit more than that. Do you know where everybody works in your congregation? Do you know what school they go to, what their favorite classes are, what they like about the class? You could just, we could come up with pretty quickly a series of conversation prompts that people felt comfortable asking each other, so they get to know everybody in the congregation. You know, you don't find out about these amazing stories about people that till they died, and you hear about it in their obituaries.
Yes.
So you get where I'm going. So there's that kind of stuff. There's all of the young people who are magical on the computer, who might be able to actually, through Zoom, by the way, help the elders learn to connect to Zoom, or through, I'm sitting there thinking of the different elements of a relationship that can happen that isn't about just a hobby. Some people even can explore how, at least I think Lisa Kimball at Virginia Theological Seminary talks about how you get people comfortable exploring scripture from different perspectives into different generations, and what happens when a teenager brings their life experience to a Lexa Divinas experience versus a senior citizen bringing it. Yeah, that's not the same hobby, but it's a different kind of way of being in relationship to each other, bringing your life to that. So I guess to me, it's about expanding what it means to be in relationship through all the different aspects of the life of the church, so that we can be in conversation and get comfortable with, we're doing that with our young people and with our people in our age group and people of other ages. To begin thinking holistically about different parts of our relationship and expecting it moving below the surface on that.
May I say one more thing, Karen Marie?
Certainly.
I think actually, for me, a really exciting way to think about this is through seeking, really more intentionally seeking greater diversity as opposed to greater similarity, whether with respect to hobbies or interests, racially, ethnically, socioeconomically, with respect to sexual orientation or gender identity. I think personally, and I see this in a lot of younger people, there's more excitement and interest around those opportunities than it is trying to sort of find the one or two things that that sort of we can rally around with respect to interests. And so I think of, in terms of my own experience and the congregation that we participate in, we go to a gathering and there's food from, Africa and South America and Central America, European influences. There are customs that people learn about that are different than their own. There are perspectives, no doubt, that range across what typically we might experience in congregational life. And I think the smart money for me is really focusing energies along those lines toward more heterogeneity, more diversity, more inclusion, as a way of bringing people into the life of the church.
And what I would say to that, Allan, is that's what young people, many young people at least, are experiencing in their schools and other parts of their lives. And they show up at the congregation saying, what's going on here? This is not real.
Right. I agree.
So we have just a couple minutes left. And so I'm going to invite each of you to take about a minute and just share with us something that you'd like to say as a closing remark, something you'd like to leave us with, whether it's from the research you've done or anything else that you think would be a word to the gathered congregation of those who are watching and listening.
Well, I just spoke, so what one of you has to say something next?
Okay, I'll go. I first will say thank you, Karen Marie, for hosting us and shaping the questions so that we could participate so nicely. I think for me, what I I'm struck by is how rich and complex the conversation becomes so quickly, and yet how simple it is at the same time. And to me, that's both exciting and frustrating, I guess, because none of these pieces you can pull apart and just deal with one thing. But I guess that's life, isn't it? Um, but for me, what I think is the idea that we can begin by engaging with people, someone we don't know, and beginning a conversation, and that it can start, and we can begin working on thinking beyond where we are now is really a important. I think it's just those important first steps, but then not stopping there and beginning to think about the imagination of what happens when we can't actually get together in a coffee shop. Does it have to be the same people we were getting together with before? And how do we begin to expand our worlds, our congregations' worlds, to look a little different than they did before the pandemic? And so I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation this week.
Yeah. I want to also thank everyone for this opportunity, for the invitation from President Blunt to all the very, very, very helpful conversations from Clay and Kira Marie, Rebecca, everyone, and my colleagues Allan and Jean for really giving some very helpful ways to think about not only your research and what you're doing, but also how it connects with my own and how that can help me develop my ideas a little bit more. And thanks to the audience for journeying with us, and particularly with my topic that is not the feel-good topic for a lot of people because, as I said in the lecture, there's a lot of denial around teen dating violence that is actually been written about. So in light of that, my hope is that religious leaders, whether they're ordained or not, will continue to think about the issues of embodiment, as I've offered it through tangible grace, and also, or more specifically, the problems of teen dating violence. That, as the CDC has indicated, is a health crisis. I did a workshop in 2018 titled #MeToo Tweets the Pastor, which was a way of signaling that there are pastors that also care about people who are in abusive relationships. And it is my hope and prayer that those of you who have not joined that #MeToo uh, group, that you now find some ways of thinking about how you can be an advocate for young people who experience intimate partner violence. So, thank you.
Well, I would echo all those words of appreciation. Deeply grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this gathering. I've learned so much that I'm going to continue to process well beyond today. So thank you. And thank you, Kara Marie, for being such a great panel host and for being so gracious in other ways as well. It occurs to me that we have a tremendous opportunity within faith communities within the world to really recognize and to claim, or maybe for some of us reclaim, the values and the commitments and the beliefs that make us most human. And for me, and I think for all of us, that centers fundamentally on relationships. And if this pandemic does anything good, and I think it is and will continue to do some things good, I think it's calling us back to sort of the foundations of being in relationship with one another in authentic ways, in committed, intentional ways, in open ways, so that we're mutually transformed by those relationships. And maybe we haven't had the space or allowed ourselves to have the space to do that before these days, but I'm hopeful that good will come out of this this tragedy that we continue to experience.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being willing to spend another hour with all these participants and those of us at UPSIM. It's really been a great opportunity to explore what faith formation looks like for our young people in a multi-religious world, but also to explore the intersections with our own lived experience of this pandemic as a part of the dynamics of living in a multi-religious world. Clay, over to you.
Thank you, Karen Marie. We thank you all for joining us for this year's Sprunt Lectures, and especially we thank Dr. Allan Cole, Dr. Evelyn Parker, and Dr. Eugene Roehlkepartain for their virtual presence with us here yesterday and today. And again, our thanks to our panel moderator, Dr. Karen Marie Yust. We also remain grateful for our preacher for Sprunts, the Reverend Jessica Tate, along with her worship planning team, the Reverend Amantha Barbie, Hannah Garrity, and Doug Brown, for our service of worship and communion yesterday morning. What a delight it has been to have all of you with us. And another thanks to Mike Frontiero, our communications director, who has really been the producer for all of these virtual gatherings this last couple of days. Next year's lectures are scheduled for May 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 2021. The Sprunt lecturer will be the Reverend Dr. Ted A. Smith, who is professor of preaching and ethics at the Candler School of Theology, Emory University. The preachers for Sprunts will be the Reverend Meg Peary McLaughlin and the Reverend Jarrett McLaughlin, now serving as co-pastors of the University Presbyterian Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Plan to be with us again next May, hopefully back here on our Richmond campus, God willing, and also offered, I hope, on Zoom as well. Members of the Black Alumni Association are reminded of our annual meeting, which is scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock, when you will be invited to join the Zoom web link that you were sent. Dr. Brian Blunt will now offer his closing remarks and our benediction.
Thank you very much, Clay. And thank you, everyone. I want to share my thanks with our outstanding lecturers for this 2020 Sprunt Lecture Series. The topic is, as we know, critical for the church as we lean into our future. And you gave us some creative, inspiring, and provocative, in the best way, material to listen to and to consider. So thank you, Allan, Evelyn, and Jean, for stimulating our thinking and prodding us to creative action in the future. I also want to thank Clay McCauley of the Alumni Affairs Office and the whole Alumni Affairs Office. It's a small office, but they have done a Herculean job in bringing these Sprunt lectures to be. Thank you, Clay, for your logistics and preparation. I also want to thank Karen Marie Yust. Thank you, Karen Marie, for all of the ways in which you've helped with logistics and then also helped with hosting, and along with Professor Becky Davis for her help in doing that as well. And like Clay, I really enjoyed and found meaningful worship yesterday. So thanks to Jessica, Amantha, Hannah, and Doug. And then finally, I also want to put a pitch in for Ted Smith, next year's Sprunt lecturer. He is going to be talking about the future of the church as well. I know some of the work that he's doing. I think you will find that incredibly exciting. And also we'll find that it'll be the second year in a row. Allan, you talked about being in my class at seminary. Ted was also a former student. So for the second year in a row, I'll have former students to welcome to the Sprunt lectures, and that is meaningful for me as well. Finally, thanks to all of you for creatively adapting during this time of pandemic and attending the lectures virtually. I hope you found the lectures to be helpful for all of your thinking and your work. Blessings to all of you, and do be safe. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us now, henceforth and forever, as we depart from one another virtually this time. May God go with you. Blessings.